In this third installment in the series, I will continue to expand upon the definition of interference as a broad economics term by briefly discussing the role of interference in a labor agreement as per popular request. More specifically, I will introduce two hypothetical labor agreements as examples of the application of interference in regards thereto. The first is a simple exchange of goods for services, and the second is an agreement to employment. I will conclude by beginning to introduce how interference manifests in labor agreements when one party lacks the ability to consent. The first example is the exact same example we used in the first installment in this series. I will post a link to that video in this video's description. The example to which I am referring is the example of Farmer Brown and Farrier Smith. Smith agrees to shoe Brown's horses for a year in exchange for 10 bushels of Brown's oats. In this case, as previously discussed, we have an entirely mutually consensual transaction. Both parties agree to offer their consent to the transaction, and both parties thus benefit from the exchange. In the first video, we gave a number of examples of activities that could act to interfere with either the mutual consent or the transaction itself, including the introduction of outside criminality, such as hooligans setting fire to Brown's oat silo, the introduction of inside criminality, Smith stealing Brown's oats, and the introduction of government action, an injunction to order the termination of the agreement. The second video introduced the element of deceit as a source of interference. I will post a link to that video in the description of this video as well. To briefly expand, Smith is providing a service to Brown. In an ideal world, the transaction would be entirely mutually consensual. As discussed in the first installment, it is the introduction of interference with mutually consensual transactions that acts to increase the cost of these transactions, and, as explained in the second installment, the increase in cost is equal to the cost of overcoming a source of interference. As such, it is always the goal of a well-run economy to minimize interference. As discussed in the first installment, again, there are rare circumstances in which governmental interference can act to, at net, reduce the total amount of interference when there is an already existing source thereof. In our example, Smith wants Brown's oats more than he wants the time he would spend shoeing Brown's horses, or else he would not engage in the transaction. Further, Brown wants his horses shoed more than he wants the 10 bushels of oats. In this exchange, therefore, both parties proverbially win and become more wealthy as a result thereof. Suppose, however, a regulation is put into effect that would preclude this exchange by requiring that a farrier not engage in a year-long shoeing contract for less than 12 bushels of oats. In this case, Smith would certainly rather have 12 bushels of oats than 10, but now, so would Brown. As such, Brown would not want to engage in the transaction, and would certainly, in an ideal world, simply not have Smith shoe his horses. In this manner, the new regulation has acted to interfere with, to some degree, Brown's willingness to consent and, more so, with the transaction itself. Referring back to the second installment, this regulatory hurdle can also be overcome if Smith innovates in a manner such that the quality of his shoeing is so improved that it can justify the added expense. Conversely, this hurdle can also be overcome if Brown innovates in a manner that reduces the cost to him of producing his oats to a level in which 12 bushels of oats is now worth what 10 bushels of oats was formerly worth. We should now begin to see how interference inevitably begets price inflation. In this case, the cost of overcoming the hurdle is the cost of innovation, which is, in this case, manifested in a price inflation. What may go missed, however, is that if the innovation took place without the interference, the price increase would not be necessary. For example, if there were no regulation and Brown were to innovate in a manner that reduced the cost of oats to Brown, he could become wealthier when engaging in a labor trade transaction, and at the same time, so does Smith, who gets the 10 bushels of oats, which he sees as more valuable than the time he spends shoeing Brown's horses. By contrast, if Smith innovates and is able to produce a better product for the same price, Brown can, again, become wealthier by getting a better product. Further, by producing a better product, Smith can expose himself to a client base he normally would not be able to expose himself to, and becomes wealthier through scale. Smith could, further, offer the old shoeing process as well, but at a cheaper price. In this manner, both parties proverbially win from the innovation. Both become wealthier, their products become better, and the price of the original transaction decreases. If nothing else, it should be noted that the regulation would preclude the exchange occurring at 11 bushels of oats. Further, there is always a cost to innovation. In modern times, this would be the cost of research and development. When forced by regulation to innovate, the only way to expedite the innovation process is to increase the cost of the innovation process. Without the interference, the innovation would still naturally happen, but without any otherwise unnecessary costs, which will always exceed the benefit the expedition provides. Otherwise, companies would innovate at the expedited rate without the added regulation. The aforementioned regulation creates what is called an artificial price floor, and this is a form of interference. To see this effect in modern terms, I will introduce a modern strict employment transaction. Bill owns a landscaping company. He is looking to hire a landscaper. Larry is a landscaper. He is looking for employment. As previously discussed, if Larry speaks no English, the language barrier can act as a source of interference in what would otherwise be a mutually consensual transaction. Bill has no obligation to hire Larry, and Larry has no obligation to work for Bill. As such, Bill can offer his consent to agree to hire Larry to work at a given rate, and Larry can refuse to offer his consent by simply refusing Bill's offer. Conversely, Bill could refuse to make an offer to Larry. In this case, if Bill and Larry agree to terms and Bill hires Larry, we have witnessed a mutually consensual transaction. If an artificial price floor is introduced, Bill and Larry may not be able to consent to the original terms. Bill may simply refuse to hire Larry. In terms of innovation, Larry could develop a new skill which would justify hiring him at the increased rate. However, this is time-consuming and quite expensive, and may even be flatly beyond Larry's capacity. Further, in the original transaction, Bill would rather have Larry's labor than the wage he would offer Larry, and Larry would rather have the wage than the time he spends working for Bill. Both parties become wealthier. The introduction of the price floor acts to interfere with this mutually consensual transaction in the same way it did with Farmer Brown and Farrier Smith. It is possible that Bill, the business owner, would, at the new price point, rather have the productivity of a machine than the productivity of Larry and the labor he would provide. In this case, Bill at net at best breaks even, and Larry, who would rather have the wage at even the lower price than none at all, loses greatly. In this case, the price floor has actually hurt the very person it was intended to help. Of course, if Larry gains a new skill set, for example, welding, Bill might be able to justify hiring Larry at the new price point. However, if Bill was looking to hire someone with Larry's newly acquired skill set in the first place, Bill would not be seeking a landscaper with Larry's old skill set in the first place. In this respect, it is clear that Bill would rather pay Larry the lower price for less skill than the higher price for more skill, or he would be looking for that greater skill set in the first place. In this case, at net, Bill actually loses long term, and Larry, who would rather not learn to weld and simply take the lower pay rate, otherwise he would already be working in that direction, at net loses as well. But what if Larry lacked the ability to consent entirely? How would Bill know if Larry lacked the ability to consent? In some cases, it would be plainly obvious. If Larry were, for example, an infant who has not yet learned to even speak, clearly Larry cannot possibly consent to the transaction. At what point does infant Larry become able to consent? This is a very difficult question to answer. However, this is the reason child labor laws exist. Children lack the ability to consent. Virtually all U.S. states have an objective standard for the age of consent as a way of offering an objective measure to avoid the interference introduced by constant litigation brought on by case-by-case evaluations of the capacity to consent. Age of consent regulations, however, are not a case of governmental interference, as they act as a floor, a threshold, above which government has actually precluded itself from interfering. That said, it is not illegal to transactionally engage with those under the age of consent. A 12-year-old buying candy at the candy store probably has the ability to consent to exchanging a quarter for a piece of candy, even in a state which would deem him under the age of consent. To avoid litigation, the candy store owner may choose to engage with the child's mother instead, who has been granted control over her child's capacity to consent. The same could be said for the mentally handicapped and certain elders who have assigned another member of the family the power of attorney. In law, any contract or transaction with a minor is considered unilaterally voidable, meaning the minor may exit the transaction at essentially any time and avoid the consequences thereof. The exercise of this right is called disaffirmance, and I recommend this term as further reading. The courts have historically granted protection of disaffirmance only when exercised as a proverbial shield rather than a proverbial sword. A child may not deceive a store owner by feigning consent to a transaction they know they will deliberately abuse. In this case, the child has introduced the element of deceit, a source of interference we covered in the second installment. However, if the child genuinely lacked the ability to consent to the transaction at the time, mutual consent clearly was not achieved in the transaction, and the courts would be justified on many metrics to nullify the transaction. It should be noted that the child's ability to consent is not itself a source of interference, as his ability to consent cannot interfere with, well, his ability to consent. The subjective nature of this ability to consent amongst children can be a highly contentious matter and is well beyond the scope of this discussion. However, the fundamental argument for child labor laws at a very general level is to help ensure mutually consensual transactions. I hope this has clarified the role of interference in labor transactions. In my next installment, I intend to integrate the concepts introduced in this and the prior two installments and, if time permits, explain how the concept of interference is the justification for the importance of the broad protection of a guarantee of free speech. So if you've liked this presentation, stay tuned, subscribe, and I will have a new video out for you shortly. As always, I welcome your input in the comments section and encourage viewers who enjoyed to click the like button. Until the next time, this is Mike from the Captain Phoenix channel signing off.